Okay, welcome back everyone to Art in Motion Expo, sponsored by the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art at Kansas State University. We're about to begin our second presentation about Waylande Gregory, the artist Waylande Gregory's techniques. I spoke about Waylande Gregory and our new virtual exhibition in the last talk. If you have questions, I'll just say during this presentation, please be sure to write them in the Q&A, and then we will give them to the speaker after he finishes his talk, the portion of his talk in which he is speaking. But let me introduce him. Before moving to Manhattan, Kansas, to lead the ceramics program at Kansas State University, Nick Geankoplis was a practicing artist and professor in Beijing, China, where he taught in the Alfred Central Academy of Fine Art Ceramic Design for Industry program. His experience in ceramics began at the turn of the millennia and has taken his work and research to nearly a dozen countries. Formerly educated at Southern Oregon University and Sierra Nevada College for his undergraduate studies, Geankoplis received his Master of Fine Arts degree at the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University in 2013. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. So I would like to start by saying I'm not a Waylande Gregory expert, but I will lend you some of my insights into the ceramic process and things that I've learned about Waylande and his work and the Cowan pottery since I've been introduced to it. So we'll cover some of the basics of ceramics, production potteries, and large-scale sculptures. And that's a sort of effort for us to get a deeper appreciation about Waylande's work and the design productions coming out of Cowan pottery. And I'm really hoping that this will sort of lead to a more fruitful and kind of robust conversation afterwards. I think that's where this can be really interesting for everyone. Slide. So we're going to dive into a little bit of technical stuff in the beginning. So first, some basics. So the true sort of frustrations for anyone who's ever worked in clay that has to do with drying and shrinking. So what wet clay, or what we think of as modeling clay, is about 25% water. So that means that it will shrink more or less 5% as it air dries. And what you can see here in this diagram is the water represented by the black, and the rectangular forms are representative of clay platelets. Slide. So during drying, it's essential to have our work dry evenly. And if it doesn't, it leads to warping and cracking. So as you can imagine, many of the forms that Waylande Gregory designed for Cowan pottery were particularly susceptible to cracking and warping because of their delicate, thin, or exposed components of his designs. Even drying is also exceedingly important when we're working with large sculptures because of the various masses of the sculptures themselves. And some of Waylande's sculptures dried for weeks before they were fired in the kilns. And then while they were in the kilns, they fired for weeks as well. Slide. So then, as we sort of continue down the perilous path of ceramics, we can kind of see here a sort of better example of when we go from the wet stages of clay all the way through to the firing stages. And I think this slide really helps us visualize that. And as I mentioned before, clay shrinks about 5% when it's air dried. It also shrinks about 5% once it's fired to its highest temperature. And this, of course, can vary in clay bodies, and some clays shrink as much as 18%. So there's no doubt that Waylande had calculated the exact shrinkage of his clay bodies for the work that he was making and sculpted or prototyped them larger in anticipation of that shrinkage. Slide. So outdoor sculptures in ceramics. I think that some might say that this is the sort of pinnacle of alchemy and creativity. And then adding water to the equation makes it even more challenging. So light dispelling darkness, in my mind, is likely one of Waylande Gregory's most challenging sculptures, certainly from a technical ceramics perspective. It's certainly not as large as some of his murals, but it really comes with its own set of challenges. And in particular with outdoor ceramics, they have to be fired to a very, very specific point or temperature, where the clay has melted enough to be vitreous, which means that it's dense enough to prevent water from entering the body. But the body is not, the clay body is not melted so much that it begins to distort or lose its form, or it can actually start to boil. Slide. So I think this is a really, really great slide. So this shows us what's actually happening in the kiln when we fire ceramics. So go ahead and click it again. It should have, there we go. So as we can see, it doesn't seem to be, there we go. So as you can see here, the temperature is increasing from each of those pictures. And the circle on the left gives you an idea of scale. So that circle is representative of the end grain of a human hair. So these images are taken by an electron microscope from the Alfred University's ceramic engineering facilities. And you can see as it begins, it's very open. There's a lot of topography. And then the last image, it's melted together. It's almost glass-like. Slide. And then here you can see in B, that's outlined there in red, an example of that ideal temperature zone that I was talking about, where the clay is not underfired and it's not overfired, and it's what we call mature. So this temperature window may be only 50 degrees, where the clay has begun to melt around the larger particles, cementing them together, and closing off some of those small pockets of porosity, but it's not melted so much that things are starting to distort or boil. And the specific maturity of a clay body is determined by the chemical composition of that body and the object's intended purpose. Slide. So production at Cowan Pottery they utilized a process called slip casting to make the vast majority of their products. And these were produced both in limited edition runs, much like printmakers might, as well as much larger quantities, sort of unspecified and specified runs. And Cowan Pottery, like nearly all other potteries after the Industrial Revolution, and before the post-war studio pottery movement, embraced a division of labor in the production of their wares. So this meant that there were glazers who glazed the work, there were casters who slip cast the work, and then cleaners who detailed the works after they came out of the molds. There were kiln masters who fired all of the kilns, and of course, designers who drew new designs and sculpted new prototypes. And within the first 10 years after opening, Cowan Pottery had employed 35 people and were producing approximately 175,000 pieces a year. So if we sort of break that down, it's about 485 pieces each and every day, day in and day out. And Waylande Gregory was the only full-time designer other than Guy Cowan, which I think is pretty amazing. Slide. So to talk a little bit more about the process of slip casting. So it's a process whereby liquid clay is poured into a mold and part of that liquid thickens and the remaining liquid is poured out. And our earliest examples were first seen in about 200 BCE in Peru. And they were certainly used widely throughout Asia. And we see it coming into really widespread use in Europe after the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the studios of Josiah Wedgwood. Slide. So, excuse me, how slip casting works. A mold is made of a prototype, and it's made out of some type of porous material, and certainly in ceramics, this is most commonly plaster. And after the prototype is removed and the mold is dry, casting slip is poured in. And while the casting slip is in the mold, water from the slip itself is sucked into the plaster mold by a capillary action. So clay particles are forced parallel against the mold walls, and they align to create an equal density throughout the inside of the mold. And after a set amount of time, somewhere between 15 minutes and 2 hours, and this time also correlates to the thickness of the wall, the remaining clay is then poured out. Slide. So why slip cast? Well, it allows us to get very detailed duplicates. Obviously, this is an advantage when we're making catalogs and reproducing items and selling to a public that expects a certain quality and consistency. It also allows us to experiment with clay recipes that are not really suitable for modeling or sculpting or throwing. And it creates really consistent results that allow for much shorter production times. Slide. So I think these are two really excellent examples of the technical mastery of the Cowan pottery production process, and also how, as a designer, Waylande Gregory was really willing to take risks and push the envelope of what's possible with slip cast ceramics. You know, you can imagine the difficulty in controlling the drying on the delicate leg and neck of the herring on the image on the left. And the same is certainly true with the sculpture on the right, where that delicate thin hand suspends the fabric. And it's also clear that this piece was fired perfectly, because if it was overfired, even with the slightest excess of melting in the clay body, it would have toppled over. Slide. So switching gears a little bit, I'd like to highlight a pair of well-known sculptors that operated within a few decades of Gregory, and in particular, how they built their sculptures and how Gregory's construction was different. In fact, he developed an entirely new technique on his own. So here we see the work of Viola Fry, the San Francisco-based artist who was a leader in the sort of funk ceramics art movement. And in that center image, we can see her working on a large vessel in a traditional coil building method. And then on the left, we see her much later in her professional career. Fry is using basically the same method to create her large-scale sculptural figurative work. And I use the term coil building sort of loosely because Fry actually works with chunks of clay, sort of squeezing them and working around sectionally and attaching them. But ultimately, the way the work gains height is layer by layer, much like what we think of as like what a 3D printer might do. So this is actually a very common method that's still used in like throughout the ceramics field today. Slide. And then, of course, many of us will know the work of Peter Voulkos. He was the influential artist and educator from the Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles. And excuse me, Peter's way of building was obviously very different than Viola's. And his work was a lot more about assemblage and left evidence of the process. So each piece was typically thrown, cut and altered, and then attached. And, his drawings were very sort of inspirational and not like blueprints at all. And his process really focused on improvisation. And for his clay sculptures to survive the drying and firing process, they really relied on thick, bulky connection points and forms that didn't need extensive, I guess you would say, engineering or internal structuring. Slide. So this is Waylande Gregory's sculptures. And a honeycomb technique is how Gregory's unique style of ceramic sculpture construction has been described. And I think it's just really exciting to see this because it's pretty rare to come across a totally new building technique after a field has been around this long. And I think what makes this technique so kind of exciting and unique is that it allows a sculptor to build a very strong and robust internal structure with pretty minimal material. And that allows us to dry the work faster, fire the work for a shorter period of time, and ultimately makes it a much stronger piece. So after that honeycomb is constructed, slabs of clay are added to that internal mesh to give it a sort of exterior skin that can then be molded or formed and detailed to create those sort of deco stylized shapes. But before the skin is added, each of the cells of the honeycomb have to be pierced so that they can all be connected. And if we look closer, on the image on the left, you can see some of those holes connecting each of the cells. Now, this is to avoid trapping large pockets of air. And if any of you have worked in ceramics or taken ceramics classes before, you'll know the destructive nature of air pockets. So when a sculpture is fired in a kiln with air pockets, these will trap steam and explode. So looking at this image, I can deduce that Gregory not only connected all of them, but then that there was some sort of vent hole or opening, almost like a sort of network of tubes, essentially, that were built into the structure to evacuate that steam, which is just a whole nother layer of kind of incredible. Slide. And then, when I was introduced to this unique style of sort of engineering ceramics, I really, in my mind, sort of thought that it was particularly suited to the sort of soft contours of the Art Deco style. And I really questioned, mostly for my students, if it would be successful in sort of realistic, really detailed sort of renderings. And as we can see on the image on the left, I was entirely wrong. And I think this is yet another example of how Waylande Gregory was such an exceptionally sort of skilled and innovative artist, truly. And then lastly, just as a little side note, a sort of technical side note, I've included the image on the right to show how these massive sculptures were moved into the kiln, and one of his techniques to prevent them from cracking. So they were built on top of a sort of refractory, which means high temperature, shelf. And then on top of that shelf was a sacrificial slab of clay that created a buffer in between the shelf itself and the sculpture. And we call this, typically we call it a shrink slab. And the shrink slab itself will shrink with the sculpture as it's fired. But because the kiln shelf, the refractory shelf, does not shrink in the kiln, it will drag on that shrink slab and crack the slab. But it ends up being this really lovely sort of sacrificial buffer between the two. And you can see how thick his are. Typically, we work with him much smaller, but clearly he's working with these massive sculptures and needs that. And then I also noticed just a few days ago, actually, when I was looking at this image, all the way to the right, we can see that there are some pipes there. And I'm nearly certain, and it is speculation, but nearly certain that this is how he moved these large sculptures into and out of the kiln by just using these heavy duty roller pipes. And the work was perhaps pushed into the kiln, and then shims were put in to lift them up, and the pipes were removed, which I think is, just a very simple but elegant way to move that in without our kind of modern day forklifts and massive structures that we typically use. So I hope that I highlighted some of the exceptional things that Waylande Gregory brought to design of Cowan pottery and some of the really innovative moments in his sculptures. And at this point, I think we can probably move into a conversation or a chat after that. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
We can just give it a minute for people to contribute questions to the Q&A.
Sure. I thought, we had that question about his glass work, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think I don't want to sound controversial, but I'm not sure that it's a highly technical process. I think that he was taking more or less what we think of as fritted or borosilicate sort of regular glass and just like putting that inside the work and letting it melt. And I've seen examples of that done before with, when people break their windows or bottles around the house, and you can put that into the ceramics to pool it. Beyond that, I don't have any technical insight into it, but it was very interesting that he was trying to patent this method. But nonetheless, yields some very beautiful pool-like, surfaces on the interiors.
Have you done any research or have much exposure to this process of producing these really large works for, say, buildings in the 1920s in something like it's something like the Atlantic Terracotta Company, that room, the pressing room? I found that so fascinating. You have to have these guys who are, working with this heavy clay and like pushing it into these.
Yeah. So there's actually, during my graduate experience, we went to visit one of the last, what they call architectural terracotta production sites in America. And it's, for those of you who are interested, it's Boston Valley Terracotta. And they do historical reconstructions for buildings, but they also have some pretty high-tech new cladding that they're covering really like contemporary architectural buildings in. But they had, just like you described, this big warehouse and a lot of people press molding and kind of throwing these chunks of clay into these really big sort of gargoyle forms that they were working on, and then kind of pinching out these internal structures to hold them together. But still, none of the internal structuring looked anything like what Gregory would do for his sculptures. Yeah, it was a pretty amazing production center to visit.
I can't imagine. This is related. So the mural that we now have that was produced for the Columbus Post Office, I was just trying to decide in my mind whether he would have created that honeycomb like as a backing and then pressed the front design fairly shallowly and then pulled it out and adhered it to the honeycomb, or whether he would have pressed the whole thing and then cut out the honeycomb. Do you know what I mean?
I do, yeah. So if you're working from a negative, is what we would call the sort of recessed image. If it was a mold, you would press into that and often then build from that base, build in the honeycomb and the walls for it.
Okay.
And I've seen some artists who work almost like a monoprint, where they might be laying down slips and glazes and then putting a thin layer of clay and then peeling that off and putting it on something. But that's much more about surface decoration as opposed to texture, like what our mural is.
Hey, Liz, Nick, this is Eileen.
Hi, Eileen.
Hi, this is a really great presentation. I mean, so cool. So I have two questions. So my first question is, you know, what Liz was talking about, the honeycomb technique, which I understand Waylande Gregory invented that. Is that right?
I've not seen that kind of gridding in any other sculpture process. I mean, there's lots of people that do things that we don't know, but certainly none that's been highlighted. Yeah, I would attribute that to him.
How do you make that honeycomb structure? Like I mean, you were talking about slip casting and, you know, all that. Like, how do you get those holes in there?
So they're basically just kind of pinched chunks of clay that you're just slabbing and putting together. I think he probably worked from some central mass. So there's probably a 6 or 8 inch kind of central mass to them. And then he built the honeycomb outward to the more or less planes that the structure, that the sculpture might have. That's what I would guess. And then going through and cutting holes so that they all connect. That's the part that I just like, that blew my mind, because you sort of initially think, oh, this is going to be a great idea. And then you realize, no, you're making, you know, hundreds of little, like the substantial pockets. And then looking at those images closer, you can see how they're all connected with those holes. So ultimately, there was some sort of port, if you will, that would let all that steam escape.
So, okay, so this second question is for you, Nick, and then also you, Liz. So it seems like if you're a ceramicist, like you kind of, is it true that you also are part scientist, that, you know, when you're planning to do something, you have to figure out the process by experimenting and, you know, knowing about temperatures and, you know, clay composition, that kind of stuff. And Liz, you know, do you know if Waylande Gregory, you know, was just as interested in the science part of it?
Oh, I'd have to defer to Tom. I think he's seen more of the correspondence, and I'm trying to think in my mind, I wish Tom could, he might be here. I suppose he learned so much about this at Cowan.
I could speculate without feeling like I'm going too far out on a limb, but if we think about Gregory's career, and him being a professor at Cranbrook, he would have to have the ability to discuss all of those points along the ceramic production process. And to address your question directly, Eileen, about the science, you know, I think as people who work in the ceramics field, there's a sort of you reach a sort of threshold where, you know, you understand enough to do what it is that you want to do with your work, and then you sort of rely on the expertise of others. So that might actually be ceramic engineers or technicians or craftsmen, kind of like I discussed in Cowan, how they had very likely kiln masters. So I would speculate that Gregory knew a good deal about those things. Whether or not he could build the kilns himself and engineer them, I don't know. As ceramic artists, we all sort of fall in a different spectrum there.
So with contemporary ceramicists like you, Nick, you know, how much of a scientist are you?
I I stay away from the word scientist just because I do know what a true scientist is. I'm somewhere in between the sort of engineer, craftsman, because I feel like most of my expertise relies on building and designing and understanding the science to a degree. But even in some of my own projects, I've collaborated or even hired ceramic engineers to do really specific technical things in the glaze chemistry that is, I would say, prohibitive for me to learn. I would spend a good deal of time learning how to solve that one problem as opposed to being a creative and working on the other artistic aspects.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you both. This was really wonderful.
Yeah, thanks, Eileen. I wanted to, so do you know of very many artists ceramicists who would have built such a large kiln, in order to produce the Fountain of the Atom pieces in their home?
Certainly at that time when Waylande Gregory was operating, he was, from my understanding, really one of the first to be working in such large scale ceramic sculpture. And it was a pretty unique thing. And, I think it goes back to his proximity to industry and industrial production. And so it's not a big leap to see the large kilns that are used for firing, 500-600 pieces, and understanding how you could utilize that to do really large scale sculpture.
Yeah. Okay. Like at Cowan. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly like at Cowan. And we start to see after Waylande, with the artists that I highlighted, those sculpture artists, doing very similar things where they would have a proximity to some type of industrial output or factory to fire a certain amount of their work. Of course, that's a broad generalization because, Volcus did a lot of other sort of alternative firings and whatnot, but that proximity to industry has been very fruitful for a lot of innovative ceramic artists.
Mm-hmm.
Nick, this is Jennifer, and I'd like to ask, when you were referencing his honeycomb process in building those larger sculptures, is that all considered hand building? Like
Yeah, that's
an
exactly
additive process?
Yep, that's exactly what we would call it, is hand building. And under the true guise of ceramic sculpture, yeah, hand building.
It seems, and maybe, you can address this, that seems contradictory to the idea of someone that's, doing slip casting or later in his career doing production pottery. Is it common for ceramicists to work in that broader range, or do they usually specialize?
Well, there's actually a lot to unpack in your question, and without diving, off into too much ceramic history, I think in Gregory's time, there was not necessarily the hierarchy that we think of often today around something that is slip cast or whether it's sort of hand built. During that post-war studio ceramic movement that I mentioned, there was a real pushback sort of industry, and we start to see these very hierarchical separations, and ceramic practitioners would really identify themselves with some certain processes and not others. And that's one of the really just refreshing things about Waylande Gregory, is the diversity in how he approached not only ceramics, because he also worked in other materials as well, but just his creative output was just so prolific. And yeah, it had so many different aspects. It's particularly exciting for me because it's very much what I'm interested in as well. As Liz mentioned, my before coming to K-State, working a little closer with industry, happened to be in Beijing, but working a lot with slip casting and production centers like that. But also doing hand building myself. was a roundabout answer. Did I?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see, here's a question from Linda Duke. Does it seem odd that these large projects weren't realized in stone instead?
I think so, but then, I think what is just really kind of compelling, if we think back to the slide of the light dispelling darkness, Gregory clearly had an understanding of what was possible within the material and his sort of resources, because that center column was actually cement, right? And those I believe it's some type of ferrous, cementatious material, like a sort of, and in his drawings, it wasn't clear which components were clay or what was cement or what, but I think to build that center column that was almost 10 or 12 feet high out of clay, he could clearly see that that was not going to be practical, but yet he built that huge 500-pound globe on top. And he knew that was possible, and that was sort of, I don't know, the sort of point at which I would assume that he defines that's where my creative expression is. That's where I draw the line. And then how expressive all of the pieces around it were as well. But yeah, Linda, I had the same kind of, when I first got introduced to the work, I'm like, why is this out of clay? This is just wild to press the envelope so far. But he really did.
Yeah, and as Tom has talked about and I spoke about, the color, Nick, would have been, I mean, you can paint stone, but we know that classical sculptures were likely painted, but it's all rubbed off. So, glaze has more permanence, although there's damage that has occurred with the light dispelling darkness pieces. But anyway, that allowed him to use color. He could do that with plaster too. At the fair, if you survey the sculpture at the fair, there isn't a lot of ceramic work at all. Some of it's probably plaster on the surfaces of the buildings, some of it's stone. But anyway, on that scale, people tend to work, if they want something to be able to withstand the outdoor elements, they do tend to work in stone or metal. And so he was pretty distinctive in that regard. And
the work is, it's so vibrant and so bright. Like, you really, I think, hit the nail on the head with how ceramics as a sculptural outdoor, just sculptural in general material, it can have that brightness of color and that pop and flash. And it seemed like he was very interested in that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was there another question that you got earlier, Liz, that you were thinking
I could have used your help with?
Yeah, I remember hearing it, and then
well, I'm not sure I might have the right question, but what's your experience about working on commission versus, there must be a fair number of people in your field who work on commission versus producing their own work like Gregory did.
Yeah. I thought your answer to the question of autonomy of form and direction of project was actually very astute. I think that probably what was happening at Cowan was pretty commission, like in that it went in field. They decided what was going to be market viable, and he probably generated many prototypes and then discussed with Guy about what would be selected to go into production. But some of the WPA pieces, those are you're proposing what it is, so you go with your vision and you bend it to some degree what you think your client may want, but ultimately you have quite a lot of voice in that.
Sometimes there's back and forth in the correspondence, and they ask for something to be handled differently. So there's some of that. You have to be flexible then, right? As an artist. And it seems like he could push the envelope because his work is so, you know, as I said, I keep using the word quirky, but it's just not conventional. It's not always so realist. You know, he's using figures, but he's using them as symbols for standing in for ideas. It's a somewhat abstract.
It's
Yeah.
risky,
Yeah.
you know. I mean, to say it like I would talk about it in terms of being risky and that it's sort of an outlier. And anytime we present things like that, and technically, right, those are a lot of things I tried to highlight, the amount of risks that he took in his work. And you know, I think he accumulated a number of successes after those risks, and he continued it. And looking at the sculptures, I think there's a clear continuity and through line to his style and choices that leads me to believe that he had a lot of voice and autonomy in that work in particular. You know, the Cowan work is harder to really, like, it was more what Cowan produced. So maybe I'm sure Tom could probably pick out what Guy had designed as opposed to what Waylande had designed, but that's a little bit less clear.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I don't think I made fully clear that I wanted to focus on Fountain of the Atom, but at the New York World's Fair, he had 3 commissions, large scale work, one for the GM building and one for the United States building, which I have not seen. But can you imagine? He was preparing 3 commissions for that fair on that scale. Fountain of the Atom was the largest, or the most ambitious, but
yeah,
he was working hard, very prolific.
Very prolific.
Okay, well, we might stop here then before our next program and take about a 15-minute break. And I hope you'll join us. Jennifer, do you think you could announce the next program?
I'd be happy to. Okay, so beginning at 3, we are going to start our final portion of the program this afternoon. This will be a talk between Field Station 4 artist Charles Lindsay and Kevin Kelly, who is the senior maverick and founder of Wired Magazine. And their talk is titled Technological Shamanism in the 21st Century. We hope you will join us. We do want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for tuning in today, and to also thank our very generous sponsors for the Art in Motion program series, Dan and Beth Bird. We could not do this without their support. So thank you, and please return at 3.
And Jennifer, I don't think I properly thanked Nick for a wonderful program. If we had you in our lecture hall, I think there would be a lot of clapping. So thank you very much.
I am certain that's true. Our thanks go out to both Liz Seaton, curator of the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum, and Assistant Professor of Art, Nick Geankoplis for K-State University. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
My pleasure.